Alireza Firouzja has been dominating 2600s during his meteoric rise to 2800, and this game is a great example of that. It was played in Norway 2020 against the young Norwegian grandmaster Tari, and it's a lovely example of Firouzja just tearing apart a king position here. So Tari kicks off with pawn to e4, and Firouzja goes in for his favourite Caro-Kann here. So we have these standard opening moves, and Tari goes in for this exchange variation. We now have bishop to d3, knight into f6, pawn to c3 here, and now Firouzja goes for a slightly unusual bishop to g4. Knight c6 is more standard, just developing that knight. Now you don't want to block with the knight here as white, or black will be only too happy to exchange, play e6, and they've gotten rid of that bad bishop. So that's why Tari goes queen to b3, hitting this pawn here, and Firouzja defends with queen to c7. Now we have h3, kicking the bishop. Firouzja drops back to d7. You don't really want to drop into here, because now white has the option to go g4, and after bishop to g6 you can exchange here, pawn recaptures, and you can actually kick on with pawn to g5. And whether you go to e4 or drop into d7, this queen can actually now snap a pawn here. So that's why Firouzja drops this bishop back to d7 here. And now we have knight to f3, the standard development. And so knight c6 now from Firouzja, castles from white, and e6 from Firouzja. So Firouzja's now lumbered with a bad bishop, and so white definitely has the better of it out of the opening. Tari now goes rook to e1, coming to that half open file. We have bishop to d6 coming onto the dangerous diagonal, and now bishop to g5. So just running it back a move here, this isn't actually the best for white, because you don't really want to swap this bishop for knight, and that bishop becomes a bit of a problem later, as we'll see. Better would have been something like queen to d1, just repositioning that queen to the e-file and preparing knight e5. And Tari did actually play this manoeuvre, queen d1, queen e2, in this exact position in April 21, so he learnt his lesson from this game. Instead he plays bishop to g5 here, and Firouzja just castles into this because he's not afraid of the capture here. Pawn would then recapture, and he's now opened the g-file against the white king, which will give him a nice attack. Plus he's taken away these crucial squares from the knight, especially this e5 square. So that's why Tari didn't actually capture here. Instead he played knight b to d2, but now this is kind of treading on the retreat of the bishop. So we had knight to h5 from Firouzja, trying to make this bishop look silly. Now queen to d1 from Tari, so right manoeuvre but slightly too late here, because this allows Firouzja to now go pawn to f6, the bishop backs up, and now knight to f4. So Firouzja's established this really strong knight here, looming over the king position, and it's hard to play g3 because of this h3 problem. So bishop back to f1 now. Tari preserves that bishop and tries to defend the king. And g5 now from Firouzja, and this is what he does so well. It's not necessarily the best move in the position, but he attacks you and he gets you thinking and puts you outside your comfort zone. So pawn to c4 now from Tari. He's trying to generate some counterplay on the queen side, which is understandable. We had king to h8 now from Firouzja, so some very direct intentions here of attacking down the g-file. Rook to c1 from Tari, logical, eyeing the queen, supporting the pawn breaks on the queen side, and rook to g8 now from Firouzja. And this is where Tari goes a bit wrong. So he still has an okay position here if he realises that he doesn't need to rush things. So he should play something like, say, king to h1 for some prophylaxis, or perhaps even a3, preparing b4, and just slowly improve the position. But what Tari does is he actually takes this knight on f4, the bishop recaptures, and he plays b4. So his whole idea here is to decoy the bishop away so that he can then get b4 in, because now if knight captures, pawn takes here, and this is just good for white, opening up the rook and getting tons of play. So Firouzja now plays queen to d6. There's a threat to capture here and then go b5 with the pinned queen, so that's why he moves it off the c-file. Tari now goes b5 anyway, the knight drops into e7, and now he plays pawn to c5, just running it back a move. It's difficult to suggest moves for him now. You know, he could try something like maybe rook c2 or rook c3, just trying to get to the defence of the king here along these ranks. but it's hard for him to actually get some counterplay now. So he tries pawn to c5, the queen drops back, and black isn't afraid of c6 because that can actually just be captured by a piece. Let's say knight takes on c6, and you can't actually pile up enough pressure to justify that pawn sacrifice. So after queen c7, Tari actually tries pawn to g3 now, but this is all getting quite desperate. Firouzja could actually immediately take here, and after captures, queen takes, bishop to g2, the immediate g4, and this is getting quite tricky. You can go knight f1 hitting the queen, let's say the queen drops to f4, and there's a lot going on here. So that's why Firouzja didn't go in for this immediately. He played g4, which is less committal with the piece sacrifice and still very, very strong. Tari now takes that pawn, which is the best move. We have rook recaptures, maintaining the pin against the king. Now we had bishop to h3, the rook drops back here, and king to h1, now sidestepping off the file. And now e5 from Firouzja, and this is one of the big problems now, is that black can bring so much extra firepower into this attack once this pawn actually clears out of the way. So Tari now swaps that bishop. It's a bit hard to suggest an alternative. If he tries taking the bishop here, well then we capture on h3 and we still have a massive attack with big problems on these light squares. So that's why he tries capturing here. The queen recaptures and now we have knight to h2. Note that if you do take this bishop, now you're running into mate in 2 with queen check, knight to h2, and now simply queen g2 mate. So that's why it's just too dangerous to open up the g file like this, and we'll see this the whole way through the game. So after this queen recaptures, knight h2, Firouzja now plays the queen into h3 anyway, preventing this capture here. We had rook to g1, trying to protect the checkmating square, rook a to g8, adding more pressure to the file. Now queen to e2 from Tari, so he's desperately hoping for some capture on e5 here, pawn recaptures, and if the bishop had disappeared in some of these variations, then the queen recaptures, either with check or pinning the g7 rook. But it's all a bit hopeless at this stage because Firouzja can simply play pawn to e4 as he did in the game, and once again the bishop's immune because if you take it we jump in with rook to g2, and after the rook takes we take back like this and checkmate is threatened and can't be stopped in any sensible way. So coming back here, that's why the bishop is still immune after pawn to e4. Instead Tari tried rook to c3, lending support here, but now Firouzja plays knight to f5, bringing more firepower into the attack. And now we had the desperado of knight takes on e4, the pawn recaptured, queen took back, and now Firouzja crashes through with bishop takes on g3, and you can't recapture, or the knight recaptures with this deadly fork, and you're losing tons of material. So Tari tried rook to g2 instead, and now simply rook e7 finished the game, because after the queen dropped back to b1 to protect this back rank here, Firouzja just goes rook g to e8, doubling down this deadly file, and there's too many threats for white to deal with. If the rook drops back here to defend that back rank, then we can simply take here. After the rook recaptures, we go queen to f3 check, and if the rook blocks, then we slide our rook back across to the g file, and if this rook comes across to defend again, then we play the nice move rook to g4, threatening rook h4 checkmate, and again there's no sensible way to defend against this. And coming back to this position, if instead the king steps across, then we still come to the g file with the rook, king f1, and queen e2 is checkmate. If you enjoyed this video and never want to miss another, then click here to subscribe, and to watch more Firouzja demolition jobs, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.